Let's see. Got it. And come back here. All right. So welcome to the third Water, Wetlands, and Watershed seminar of the semester. It's our first semester back in a long time. We have some great friends here who we haven't seen in a long time. Dr. Mark Brown, who co-ran this seminar for a long time. Yeah, back with us today. It's really great to have him here. He was also a member of Nathan's committee. Yes, right. So today we have Dr. Reaver. Dr. Nathan Reaver is a research assistant scientist at the UF Water Institute. I have this paper, but I've known Nathan for like 7 or 8. We'll see how this goes. And so Nathan did his PhD here in the Environmental Engineering Sciences Department, and I was lucky enough to get to work with Nathan, be his advisor. And then he became a postdoc working with me in the UF Water Institute. His research is primarily focused on understanding the dynamics of hydrological systems and understanding how they're going to respond to things like climate change, anthropogenic water use. Nathan's the kind of person who combines like really technically adept, smart, is not scared of any equation, with trying to understand like why it's important. So a lot of people are excited about a problem and really maybe don't have the technical skills to attack it. A lot of people are really good at technical stuff and like go off in their office and dream. And Nathan is this sort of tremendous scholar that puts them together. And so I hope I'm not like not blowing smoke. But we're going to see that today in a couple of examples. He's working on a couple of big interdisciplinary projects, and as well as being smart and hardworking, also a super kind person who's been a pleasure to work with. So we may or may not have a projector for the whole time. We're just going to wing it. So go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much, David. That was very kind. Yeah, those interdisciplinary projects that he mentioned, I'll plug them very briefly at the end, and it's somewhat related, but most of what I was talking about is not quite going to be that. Some of this work is stuff that I started during my PhD, but more recently has been publishing and working on. So I'll be talking about 2 papers. One's published and one's in review, looking at more looking at watersheds like kind of at a larger scale as opposed to the nitty-gritty details.
I'm going to turn off my email so that it doesn't ding every second and cause me stress. How about that? Okay.
So let's minimize this.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, the title of my talk is exploring the drivers and implications of water budget partitioning under a changing climate. So maybe some of you know what those are, maybe not, but we'll go through that.
You got to click on that.
Okay. Yeah, I like this one. This is actually it's just like Reaver. I did a lot of work in spring, so I always think to make pretty background and stuff. And we'll talk a little bit about that related on that. David gave me a pretty good introduction, but like I said, research assistant scientist at the Water Institute, and I do a lot of stuff with hydrological and ecological systems. Okay, so the thing is watershed water budget partitioning. So maybe we should define what those are. So I know it's mostly similar, but maybe I can ask a few questions. So what's a watershed?
Hey, we just talked about it in class, right? So what's a watershed? Go for it. Anyone?
It's one of the things.
I know there's a trick in here.
No,
no trick, no trick.
No trick. So what's the watershed?
Water.
Yeah, so this is the Swanee River. So one here was taken by Dr. Elliot White, who also worked with me here and with David. But so we'll think about what this is a point, it's close to the outlet. So it's an area of land that channels water to a single point or a drainage basin. That's one definition. You have several different ones. But we can think of this as there we go. There we go. So this is the same place. So there's a Swanee River outflow into the Gulf here. We can see we're going to look at the watershed for the surface water. So this is all the surface land area where water in that will drain down and eventually make it out either one of these 2 channels. That you can see fairly large watershed goes up into Georgia. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about watersheds and these areas that where all the water falls within there, goes to a single point. So what about a water budget? No, we won't ask this one, but So basically it's like any other budget, it's accounting for all the water going into and out of the watershed. So we have the stuff that's coming in, the precipitation or rainfall, depending, everything's rainfall here, we don't get snow too often. Maybe you remember some facts with them, but and then it can either leave through evapotranspiration, or it can get discharged. So this is our catchment, here's our outlet here. So discharge or runoff, or it can change and be stored and actually store water within the catchment. But when we're talking about water budget partition on a longer time scale, the change in storage of the catchment generally averages out to 0. So we're talking about longer time scales. So basically, the water budget partitioning is the inputs, the rainfall gets split into either ET or discharge. Everybody with me on that so far? This kind of general concept. So why do we care about water budget partitioning? Maybe this is a question I can ask as well. Anybody, why would we care about that?
So if water budget partitioning is how much of that rain goes back up into the atmosphere versus how much is flowing in the river, why would one care about such a thing?
So then you have to know how much is staying.
Okay, so you know how much is staying in. Why would you care about why it's staying in there? Well, basically, this Q here, whether it goes into the groundwater in the aquifer, it flows out in the river, goes into the lake, is all the available water. Everything else gets evaporated. So it's what's available for water resources, whether it's for recreation or drinking water, ecosystems that rely on that, irrigation. So all of these things, that's available water resources. Also, like specifically, even like if we're not using it directly, but these, so we're talking about ecosystems. Like here, this is the Swanee River, and this dark water is mixing in with the Gulf here, and so the discharge, how much water is coming in, really affects the amount of affects the ecosystem there. So the recreational fisheries, the aquaculture, and just the general ecosystem, how much nutrients are coming, the amount of the salinity in this area. Where things are salinity dependent, like oysters and other organisms. So that's why we care. So we know water budget partitioning is important. So not only is it important to, we know like, okay, if you don't have as much rainfall, that's the ultimate source of water. So it's important to understand how rainfall changes with climate, but it's also important to understand how that rainfall then gets partitioned once it reaches the watershed. So that's what we're talking about. All right. So let's see, how does water budget partitioning change across watersheds? So here I've added another arrow on this one. So this is ET not, which we're calling. So we already talked about precipitation, the actual evaporation. That means the actual amount of water that's evaporated. Then we have the potential evaporation, which is how much could be evaporated if the water was available. So some people call it like the thirst of the air. If you had unlimited amounts of water, how much could the atmosphere take? Then we have the discharge. Now I'm going to find a few other ones to help us understand going through here. So we have the aridity index, which is just the potential evaporation over precipitation. The evaporative index, which is just the actual. So you can think of this as like what fraction of the rainfall got evaporated. And then the discharge ratio, which is just how much of the rainfall turned into discharge. So what fraction of that discharge? So we're going to look at these two because if you read the abstract, we'll talk a little bit about this idea of this Budyko thing, and it uses these indices. Okay, so now we have the aridity index. I'm going to show them along here, and then we have the evaporative index. We can look at watersheds in this space, this aridity and evaporative index space. So watersheds that are the aridity index is less than 1, that means that there is more water than there is a demand for it. So it's a humid catchment, whereas if it's above 1, these are arid catchments. So you can classify all watersheds as either humid or arid based on their aridity index. All right, so then we can start putting watersheds on there. So let's here pick one. It has some aridity index, some evaporative index. We pop it on here. Pick another one. You can put it on here. A third one. And so this is, I always want you to get this in your mind that we can, the long-term behavior, the long-term potential evaporation, rainfall, and evaporation determines where these watersheds will fall in this space here. So keep this in your mind. So let's look at this one across now. Like, how does the water budget partitioning change across the globe? So I'm going to start populating. You'll see red dots showing where at, and they're going to show up in that space as well too. As you see here, we'll just kind of see what comes out. Anybody noticing anything already interesting? Or is this kind of random? Well, we're not gonna put them all on there, but and we'll jump to this one here. So this is where it would have stopped, right? So then I'll add the more. I think that's about 1,900 watersheds across the globe. Then, so it's not. I mean, you can also see where gauging is more regular, or where it's a little bit more sparse in areas, but it's a fairly good representation of it. So this is, I just pick this space. There's some sort of pattern that seems to emerge from that, right? And so these are two things you might know that drew these little lines on here and on there, and then maybe this line that goes through the cluster of those. Okay. So this is what I was taught when in the abstract, because we're talking about partitioning, this idea of this thing called the Budyko curve that comes out, just like how do catchments organize themselves in terms of water budget partitioning. So the reason why do no catchments fall outside of these two lines? Well, these are the water budget constraints. Basically, you can't have more evaporation than there's demand for, the atmosphere can't take, and you can't have more evaporation than there's actually water for. So that's why all the catchments fall below these two lines. The rest of them, this kind of behavior had been noticed for a long time. So one of the first papers on it was in 1904. Said, oh, there seems to be some sort of patterning in this water budget partitioning. And another person came on and suggested a different empirical relationship. So there's no like, they just kind of, let's draw a curve that kind of matches through this. And then the guy who actually it's named after now just came along and took the geometric mean of those two into the middle there, and then he got it named after him. I mean, a lot of other stuff. He's a Soviet climatologist and pretty famous for all the stuff. But that's who it was named after. So these are all empirical relationships that just kind of whatever fit the data. Okay, so and the important thing is it comes about out of this global behavior, and it's empirical or maybe semi-empirical. You could even say, but there is no reason why we pick these certain functions. The thing you can do is that you can use it to make probabilistic prediction about watershed behavior. Say you don't know the partitioning behavior of watershed, but you know it's in the dry area or humid area. You can at least have on some probability you can say, well, it probably falls close to this line. And so, but you can't necessarily specifically say, well, it's going to have, it's going to evaporate this much water. The catchment's going to discharge this much water. So, because this is global behavior and it's kind of a probabilistic predictive tool, there's been a lot of desire to make specific prediction for individual watersheds, because we don't like for something in Florida, if you want to know like if how our water resources availability going to change for a specific catchment, well, you can't use this Budyko framework. So there's been a lot of work in the literature that extrapolated this global curve behavior and applied it to individual watersheds. So like the idea is that each one of these watersheds will follow one of these curves. So here I took two, and so this is one functional form. People don't have to worry about this, but the idea is like that for each of these n values are each give a different curve. So let's take two watersheds here, red and blue, and let's say we put them on, they behave differently. So if we were just to plot them in this evaporative index and aridity index space, let's say they just fall here, so we draw a line through it now and this curve through it, and we say, okay, so if the climate changes and there's no other thing, we would expect it to follow along this curve is what the hypothesis or the extrapolation would be. If there's like human induced landscape change or maybe some other like a fire or something else, the idea would be that it would move vertically, change to different curves on this. And if you have both changes in climate and landscape, then it can move in different directions. So that was the idea, and there's a whole lot of work in the literature on this. And so the nice thing is like a simple deterministic method that we can estimate changes to the water budget partitioning. So say we sit on this curve and we say, well, it's going to be drier or wetter in the future. All we have to do is follow along this, and we can get an idea of what the water availability in the catchment will be in the future.
What is N?
N is just, it's just a parameter that specifies, it's supposed to represent the specifics of the catchment. So the catchment properties that tell it, like, if I were to say, okay, it has a aridity of one's up here and one's down here, the N just says, oh, it has a different evaporative index. So
It's empirical and it's supposed to lump a whole bunch of stuff,
into one single value. And so,
which made Nathan mad, which is why he did this entire thing. Yeah.
well, we were trying to use it, basically, we were trying to use it, and then we found out that that's why the question, is it valid? Well, we were trying to use it and it didn't really make a lot of sense on that. And so this is one of the tests. So that this is the paper that just came out this year. It's been a very long process, like rejected a bunch of times, I think, but it came out this year. And so this was, so the idea was, okay, well, this is really prevalent, and a lot of people want to use it for productive things within science. So can we actually test whether or not catchments follow these individual curves? So what we did was we selected a bunch of reference watersheds in the United States and the UK. And so these reference watersheds basically have, the reason they're referenced, they have stable landscapes, minimal human influence. And so the only changes you would expect them are changes in climate. And so if this hypothesis is correct, they should all just only follow along these curves. Oh, maybe I should have back up to make it angry.
Good spirits.
Yeah. And so we took all these and then we tested to see if their actual trajectory, so you look at how they move across over time, follow those predicted Budyko curves. And so do I have a, oh, it doesn't pop up here. I was going to say, if you read the title, and maybe not, that the spoiler alert, that evidence against this. So it's so that we tested a whole lot of trajectories. So there were 700 of those, but we also had different averaging windows and stuff. So we ended up testing 24,000 trajectories of these catchments through space, and we found that 95% of them didn't follow that, and 5% of them were statistically indistinguishable. What you might notice is, for anybody doing statistics, right? So we used a p-value of 0.05 and we got the exact breakdown, right? So basically that's exactly what you would expect if they didn't follow these curves, right? And so here I'm showing a few examples of them in space. So here's what the predicted trajectories would be, is the dotted line, and that's in the long-term behavior is the black dot, and then the red or the blue is what they actually did. And so the blue ones are ones that are actually statistically indistinguishable, and they kind of look like they follow these curves, but you see that most these other examples are not. Here I'm going to show, yeah. So I guess the take home on is that they rarely follow these trajectories. So, so here, yeah, this is so this is all the 728 of those catchments, and then all I've done now is I've changed it to a log scale, so not all the human catchments aren't all crunched up down at the at near zero. And so the blue line is the empirical Budyko curve, and the black dots are the long-term behavior. So black dots generally follow the blue curve, and the clump of red, all those individual trajectories, generally follow the blue curve. But you see all these gray curves they go through, that's what all the red lines should be following, the gray curves, if the hypothesis was correct. So kind of the idea of this is that, yes, there is this Budyko curve that both the trajectories and the catchments in general follow. It's this global emergent behavior, but you can't apply it deterministically to individual catchments. So if you want to predict individual catchments, you can only do it probabilistically using this Budyko curve idea. All right, so the question is that where does the curve come from then? That's a plausible question. If there's this emergent behavior, we usually like to understand where empirical things come from because we can maybe learn something deeper about nature from that. So here's all the catchments and the curve on there. And so these emergent properties in general come from the behavior of individual components. So those individual components interacting with each other. In this case, it's not really those components interacting with each other because they're separate watersheds. But so in this case, we're just so we need to look one scale down essentially. So what is emergent behavior made out of? It's made out of all these catchments. So we can look at the evaporative behavior of individual catchments. So maybe Dr. Brown, like the idea of looking one scale up or down is very prevalent in the Center for Wetlands and Systems Thinking ideas. Okay, so if we have to look at the evaporative behavior, we can think of some simple evapotranspiration models. And so one of the simplest ones you can think of is a supply demand limited model. So if we have precipitation coming in and the demand is a potential ET. When we saw those water budget constraints earlier, basically you can't evaporate more water than you have available, and you can't evaporate more water than there is demand for it in the atmosphere. So one of the simplest things is that, well, P is a supply, potential evaporation is demand, and then ET is whatever is limiting at the time. So if we look at the seasonal dynamics of, say, potential evaporation, see, this is like across the year. You can think of like ET is generally going to follow this like a sine sort of behavior because it's orbiting the sun. We have winters and summer, so it's going to be highest during evaporative demand, highest during the summer, lowest during the winter. And precipitation can be a lot of different things across the globe depending on what climate you're in. But generally, it can be described with approximated with sinusoidal stuff. And so in this case, we look at this catchment, we say, what would the evaporation be? Well, we follow this, this is limiting now, rainfall is limiting now, ET is limiting. So here's what our evaporation. And for this one, our actual ET goes up, and then we're only limiting in rainfall at this point. Going down. And when you do that, you can get, we don't need to care about the actual specific expression. We get a fairly simple expression for the long-term evaporative behavior for the catchment, which basically is just saying what's the average value of the potential evaporation when potential evaporation is the limiting factor, rainfall when rainfall is a limiting factor, and then how frequently, or like the probability that potential evaporation is limited. So here's come to this other paper that has also been rejected a bunch of times. And now it's in review at Geophysical Research Letters. And the work that I did with Jim Jowett, I mean, the other paper I should say, David was on that one as well. And Jim and Hockey were also on this. But this Jim Jowett is a professor in the Soil and Waters Department, or what they just changed the name. Ecosystems Department. So, so what we did is took this idea. So we assumed, to simplify things, we assume that the potential evaporation and rainfall have these sinusoidal seasonal drivers. And we put them in the supply demand limited model. And you don't have what you can analytically come up with this, but the point of the reason I put it on there is because there's this one term, and basically that represents all the effects of the mismatch between the supply and demand. So whenever these are not perfectly matched up, that factor kind of captures it. And so what we did is we applied it to gridded data across the whole globe on this. So this is just showing gridded stream flow or runoff, but this to give you an idea of that's what all the results will be in across the globe. Okay, so the results of that. So we're doing that and applying all those sinusoidal things and coming up with this. Basically, what we were able to do is we were able to predict ET and also the discharge across latitude. So this is going from from north to south, and we can see this is the basically observed runoff is what you would expect, or the observed amount of rain. So you can think of this at this latitude band, how much discharge is going on. So the tropics have a lot more because it's rainier and things there. We can see where there's drier portions. But the red is the observed data. The black is the Budyko equation, what you would predict if you just use that empirical Budyko equation. And the blue was our expression. You see they pretty much track fairly well across that. Also, looking here, so here's the blue is the scatter, the big cloud of all the different pixels across the globe. The black dotted line is the Budyko curve, which you expect would go through the middle of it, and the blue line is is basically this equation using the average values of all the sinusoidal drivers, and what you end up getting is that you can pretty closely reproduce that Budyko curve. And then this is slight. I think it's an important point then, but the deviation, so how far away things are from the established Budyko curve, is basically driven by how far that factor is away from the average behavior. So basically, the more mismatched the rainfall is, the further away you are from that Budyko curve.
Temporal mismatch.
Yeah, the temporal seasonal mismatch. And there's a couple things. So there's when we talk about if we're talking about sign things, I guess we should mention that. So they each can have an amplitude, they each can have a phase difference between them, and they can have a mean. So there's basically three things. You can have the mean value of it, you can have how seasonal is, what its amplitude is, and then you can have are they in phase or out of phase. And so basically what I'm saying that the overall take-home message, the mismatch between the seasonal water supply and demand drive the emergence of that Budyko curve. But that's why it's so we have the upper rails are driven by the water budget, and then the mismatch between supply and demand is why that seems to be appearing. So some implications for it. Now, give you a minute to try to digest this one here, but these are what are called elasticities. So that means how sensitive the partitioning or the stream flow. So the Q, this is how sensitive is the Q to changes in the average climate. So either average increases in potential evaporations or average decreases in rainfall. So red are places where it's negatively sensitive. So if ET is larger, you're going to have less stream flow. And the more red it is, the more sensitive it is. So what this is basically a sensitivity map of if you just average change in climate. So average decrease in precipitation or average increase in temperature or potential evaporation, where in the world are they most sensitive to that average change in climate? This one is the elasticity of phase difference between the supply, the rainfall and potential ET. And then these two are what's most sensitive for the amplitude of rainfall and the amplitude of potential evaporation. And so you could look at different aspects on it, but I'm going to eventually here zoom into our region because it may be more interesting, but you can see phase difference in the Mediterranean where you already have a significant they have a Mediterranean climate there. We have, as is known, we have lots of winter rain and dry, hot summer. So that they're already significantly out of phase, but you see in that region that it's sensitive to changes in that phase is one example. Okay, so I'm got the excuse the resolution on these ones, right? But we'll zoom in. So I'm looking specifically where we zoom in here on Florida for the sensitivity to changes in mean climate and basically changes in how seasonal rainfall patterns are. And so I did a lot of work in springs here, and specifically Silver River. This is one of the, anybody familiar been to this? It's one of the largest springs in the world. Has a long history with the Center for Wetlands here. But so we know that, what do we notice here? That in particularly North Florida is very sensitive to changes in either increases in potential evaporation, so for example, warming climate, or decreases in rainfall. As that means that the discharge for any of those catchments in those areas should be very sensitive to those things. Also, changing seasonality of rainfall. How are we on time?
You got 19 minutes.
So, here is another image. This is, so we're looking up here. This is down, looking out of the, so you're in here looking out this way out of the spring vent. So, so I just wanted to show, these are the average drivers, the rainfall and potential ET for Ocala, which is pretty close to where this is at. So you have this in mind. We'll jump back to this one right here. So think of it, this figure here is the same one. You can see that they're relatively well described by sinusoids, but not perfectly. But you can see that they're also fairly well matched, that you get the most rainfall when we have the most ET. So the demand is highest when the supply is highest. In places where you're going to get the most recharge or most water runoff are places where rainfall is higher than ET, right? And so this is discharge for the Silver River. And I'll come back to that in a second, but one, you see this general decreasing trend, and maybe now there's a little bit of increase in more recent times. Well, what I'm showing here is the average, the moving average. So this is the overall like snapshot of what the climate looks like in the area. This is what the average amount of rainfall is for the area, and the average demand, the potential evaporation over time. So we see you have a decrease, general decrease in precipitation and also in heat and the potential evaporation. But once you get to this region here, what does anyone know? What would where would you fall on that humid and arid axis then? Does anyone know? So right now we talk about the aridity index is the potential evaporation over the precipitation. So here, when there's more rainfall than there's ET, it's in a humid region here. And as you get to this location, once you start dipping below, you actually become into an arid region, which is probably because these are so closely matched, and that's probably likely the reason that we're so sensitive to these changes in mean things here, is because the precipitation that. But what you notice is when we get into this arid region is actually when we have the lowest amount of stream flow in there. And while there's a general decrease, there's a stark jump around the year 2000, which is exactly when we switch into this arid zone. Also, another thing interesting is that this is kind of the timing of when the rainfall occurs. So right, we talked about a little bit about phase shift. So that is the central tendency of when the rainfall is. So this is the day of year, so it starts earlier, and basically it used to be later in the year, and if it was later in the year, that means more of that rainfall would occur during a time when there was lower demand, so you get more discharge. But now as basically the central tendency move forward, so more of the rain is coming at the time when there's high demand. And so both of those things together resulted in quite a bit lower flow in the areas. And from this, it shouldn't, so we're looking at only springs here, and it'd be nice to look at more of them, but it should be applicable to all most watersheds in the region, because springs just have a large storage because they're connected to the aquifer, but the mass balance, that partitioning doesn't exist. Okay. So before I come and do like a little bit of recap and questions, So another, I just a little plug here. So there's some other stuff that David was talking about are these. So we know that Florida's water potentially fairly sensitive, particularly to climate change and things. So these are two projects that we're working. And so this was at a high level, looking at very simple models. Like I wrote down one line on that. I'm working on two projects. We're looking at much more complicated models. We want to look at how specific management actions or specific changes in rainfall patterns on certain locations actually will impact the Florida aquifer and the springs and rivers that it feeds. So I'm on two projects. There's one, this fastest project, which is coming to a close, is looking more at the Santa Fe River and how different land uses and changes in land management, in addition to climate, will affect the health of the aquifer and the water quantity and quality. We also are tracking water quality in this. And then I showed a little bit about the Suwannee River and the importance of what's going on the land, making it to the coast. That's where this NASM project, where we're looking at how those same land use changes and stuff impact the coastal ecology, the coastal ecosystem. So do a quick recap here. So kind of the overall point of this is that Watershed water budget partitioning controls the availability of water resources for whatever reasons that they can, whatever the use is, whether it's ecosystems or human consumption. It's all that Q ultimately determines what's available on the landscape. So, and we talk about the Budyko Curve, which is this emergent property of multiple catchments, but that comes from the evaporative behavior of all of those individual catchments. And it really comes from that water supply and demand mismatch is what governs that water budget partition, because that's what actually reproduces the Budyko equation. So changes not only to the magnitude of rainfall and potential evaporation, but also the timing of it are very important for the availability of water. And as I said here, that Florida's water seem particularly vulnerable to climate impacts based on our analysis so far. So with that, I guess I'll take that while we have
Yeah, we got about 10
10 minutes. Yes.
All right, we'll start with the room and I'll see if I can get a question out of the YouTube. Any questions from the room? I'll turn on the lights just to get everyone.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
This is extremely interesting. I really enjoyed that. But I find myself thinking about in more, well, as soon as you get out of phase, things like fire are going to have a tremendous effect on watershed.
Yeah.
And so where does that appear?
Yeah, so in there, we didn't, so that's more in the analysis I showed there, none of the landscape properties show up in there, right? We're talking about only climate, and we know that at least, so I guess that's one thing is somewhat glossed over, right? In order for you to have that supply and demand limits that actually have, okay, so let's say that the evapotranspiration or potential evaporation is the limiting factor. Well, you need to have things being able to evaporate the water. If the water is below like say the rooting depth of the plants, and it's not going to be transpired. So that's assuming that the available water has a route to make it to the atmosphere, which can be very influenced by things like fire, changes in the landscape. That's where those later projects I talked about. One of the things we're really looking at are even forestry management and like thinning forests and things. And so that should have a significant impact on evapotranspiration, and it does. I think we've seen like data on that, but that doesn't show up in just if you only take into account the supply demand. It's just, I think the idea is that you're looking at it a long enough time period that those effects average out. But if you were to transition in a totally different state, then yeah, it would have a different behavior.
But I think maybe you were thinking beyond just the water impacts. I mean, the phase shift could cause just different fire behavior, fire ecology.
It'd be that much longer for actual evapotranspiration to take effect, just because it's got to start from.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good point.
So
sorry, there is a one slide that you show the real point in the board and the plot the dot on the ET against ET0.
You're talking about this one?
Yes.
Yeah.
And in the vertical side, there is no point more than one. Okay. But it means the actual evaporation is not more than precipitation. Okay. But in some part of the world, there it's similar to this. The evaporation may be more than precipitation. For example, the dot in the real world, there is no more dot in the drought area, like Middle East, like in the Africa, because you have also one graph that showed the ET more than precipitation.
Mhm.
Then we should have dot more than one.
Yeah, so if you take the entire watershed, the only way you can get more ET than precipitation is if you're getting a surplus of water from some other location. So that's either you're having a very large storage of water that's being depleted over time, or like,
Like a deep aquifer that you pump to the surface and then it evaporates.
Yeah.
Right, but it's sort of like the rain.
Yeah.
Like the rain is the only thing that's available to evapotranspire. So if you have 10 units of precipitation, you can't evaporate 11 because the cup is.
that's right, but so in certain parts of the water, if you take the whole watershed, for example, you have a rainy part of the like the Nile or something like that, you have a lot more evaporation down near the mouth of the river and not a lot of precipitation. But if you look at the entire basin, you shouldn't have more evaporation than precipitation. Otherwise, you're getting water from something. And you were talking about where some of mine were above, it's probably mostly due to like slight error in the measurement error in the data and things like that. So that's possible. But if something was way higher than that, that would just be a red flag that you're missing a water source someplace. That the precipitation you have measured is not actually capturing what's.
But couldn't there be a long lag? I'm thinking of like volcanic islands where you got this huge storage building up, and so you can see a lag.
Yeah.
before that takes
So that could be the thing too. Yeah, if you have a lag between storage, so either like if the storage is very slow to respond, then that basically decouples decouples the rainfall and the evaporation somewhat. So.
So, I mean, did anyone notice some things that Nathan didn't talk about? I want to ask you a question, but I want to just kind of like do inquiry-based learning here. Like, so climate's really important for water resources, right? Like, what did he not talk about? People talk a lot about it tomorrow now, as far as the availability of water. Didn't talk really much about pumping, didn't talk about groundwater pumping, didn't talk about water use, and like the humans, like if someone was to look at your presentation from, at this scale, be like, it doesn't matter what we do, right? Because it's this climate change, the phase between P and ET sets it up so like we can use all the water we want, no big deal. So I mean,
Yeah.
a leading question, but
Yeah. So. This is a
go to your
long
take
term.
home points, and then we'll just see how that fits in the take home points. Right, the very last bit.
The very last bit. Right?
Water supply demand mismatch governs water budget partitioning, whatever it is, right? Yeah, and Florida's water is particularly vulnerable to climate impacts, so we should, be careful about climate, but what, do we need to be careful about the other water resource decisions?
Yeah, well, and particularly like if you're in a time, so it depends where your water source, but if you're in a time where you're expected, the climate is driving you to have low amounts of discharge or just water availability. That's also usually a lot of times where people start using a lot of water for like irrigation and stuff. And so the impact can be quite a bit larger in those things. So not to say that it isn't, it just maybe when you look at the averaging over the long term, because there are places that matter, right? Where we're depleting aquifers, like this doesn't apply, right? Because you're depleting a large amount of storage. But if the storages are relatively constant, then on the long-term average, it applies, but not necessarily for shorter term things, particularly when you have low. If you have low flows, you don't have a lot of rain, you pump, we can see the impacts of what happens, so.
Can you put the curve up that showed the mismatch or the, keep going, it's early. It's, I've got the Budyko, it's all about Budyko and how it didn't, yeah, oh, right there. So thinking about that, some of the mismatch, what I call those squiggles, is along the line, the end, and some of it is above and below, right? So could it be that the above and below is changes in the characteristic of the watershed, whereas changes along the line are changes in line of drainage?
Yeah, and so that's the hypothesis that was. Now it could be, so the catchments we use should have been the reference catchments, so they shouldn't be, but you can think, okay, let's say there's long-term trends and like you have vegetation changes or something, why it's doing that. It's possible. I don't think anyone has shown, it's very prevalent, but it doesn't seem like anyone has like conclusively shown where it comes
Well, but
from.
you said that if it goes along the line, it's N, right? It's changes in the characteristics of the.
If it goes up and down.
It's and if it goes
Along
along.
the
Yeah,
line.
sorry, yeah.
That's what-
Yeah, that's what that is what is very prevalent.
Right.
In these, the assumption is that all of these catchments we use. So if we did it on just a random assortment of catchments that had like, say, they were filling up reservoirs or they had a lot of irrigation or other things, you wouldn't be able to distinguish them. But the idea was here, because we picked reference catchments, that the catchment characteristics are constant. The only thing you can't do would be like, okay, are there long-term natural changes like that change the properties of the catchment? But on these time scales, so I guess part of the reason why we looked at all these, we tried 1 year up to like 50-year averaging windows to try to account for maybe there could be changes and things on different time scales, and they all, even with all those different averaging windows, they still came out to be this 95 thing split. But yeah, that's a good point to bring up.
I have a quick question. So in here, you find that the 95% of the data set that doesn't fit the Budyko curve, right?
Mhm.
Probably because of the climate change issue. I don't know, probably because of the climate change issue is why the curve doesn't fit. So do you want to find a new curve yourself for this issue?
So I'll say that these so all the catchments, we look at this next one, the general behavior, the global behavior, all the catchments does follow the Budyko curve. It's just they don't follow these individual ones that are just that are drawn through the long-term mean. And so that's the thing. So I would say that if you want to know how a catchment's going to behave, like its water budget partitioning, you should just model its evaporation with the appropriate things. So if there are things like land use changes, you would include that in your model to say, okay, well, have those feedbacks that if it gets drier, well, maybe the plants change and that there's some feedback with evaporation. But I don't think we need to necessarily draw like some other empirical curve that for predicting what this would be. I think you should just directly model evaporation if you're going to do so, which is and then the idea that we should be able to explain the whole point. We should be able to explain this emergent behavior using our understanding of evaporation on individual catchment scale. So we have all these different catchments that have common evaporative behaviors. Then any model, anything you put forward, saying this is how evaporation works, it needs to be able to eventually reproduce the Budyko curve because that's what we see in nature. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's just the clustering of catchments, not necessarily how they behave over time. That means so.
And another thing is that in here, you only talk about the surface water, right? How about the groundwater?
Yeah, the idea is that it would include groundwater, because the idea is that groundwater is a storage. And so that storage, the change in that storage is zero over a long time. So in places where they're pumping fossil groundwater, it doesn't work. But groundwater should be implicitly included in this one. Yep.
All right, let's give Dr. Reaver another round of applause. Thank you very much. Heat turned back on for you and the projector. All right, thank you everyone on Zoom and on YouTube. We will see you next week. Cheers, everyone. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and